Before Andy has to leave us, unfortunately, because he's got a prior engagement, I think we ought to probably get on with this one. So, top three go-tos that me and Mike were discussing a couple of hours before we started this. The idea is, so top three go-to albums. So should we do this? But I've picked three that are a mixture, essentially. So it could be the go-tos for anything Genesis related. Makes it even more difficult for you.
What? So just the band or solo or everything?
Solo, band, or any of the outside projects? What would be your three go-tos, Andy?
Oh, I'm not. You ask those guys first. I'm not ready.
Okay. Mike will be ready because he's. I was going to say Mike would because he's known about this for a couple of hours.
I talk way too much, so I want to make sure that Tom can go first if he wants to.
I'll go with the shirt that you're wearing, Duke. As it's my favorite Genesis album, I think it just has everything start to finish. It's middle of the road from they're just turning sort of away from their prog days, but they're still got a foot in it with the opening 3-track suite. They've got the Duke's Travels, Duke's End, which kills me every time. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those albums where I was thinking about this recently where what's my favorite Genesis song? And I never really had one. I had like a top 5. They would always vary. Some would fall in, some would fall out. But I think Duke's Travels, Duke's End is, well, now I'm second guessing myself. It's up there. I would now say because that album can still elicit emotions start to finish, from excitement to love loss with Please Don't Touch, which people slag off, but when you hear Phil talk about it on the Face Value DVD, I mean, he's got tears in his eyes when he's talking about it, and he can't even hold the CD without welling up. I'm like, because that's from the heart. It's not just a schmaltzy love song. No, and then it goes back into Duke's Travels, Duke's End, which just always kicks ass. And when it gets to that guitar solo about 3/4 of the way through, stick a fork in me. So, and even Darrow playing it will get me. Sorry, so that's one. I'd say for the older stuff, I don't know. It's hard to pick a Peter era album that encapsulates everything. Lamb is just so involved that I don't know if I'd suggest that off the bat. Possibly Nursery Crime I would go to just because it opens strong. It's got a lot of lovely silent bits. It's got songs with heavy bits, a mixture. So that one might be one that I suggest for the older stuff. And for the solo stuff, I would probably want to open someone's eyes and ears who thinks Phil Collins Tarzan, and maybe go with one of his first 2 albums just to show the kind of variations that this isn't some guy who is going to give you a love song. This guy experiments with things. You've got the whole Roof is Leaking, Hand in Hand suite. You've got on the second album, you've got the weird stuff like Through These Walls, the anger of I Don't Care Anymore. Like,
do you care?
That's do you care? Like, and there's a song on the second side of Hello, I Must Be Going, which also gets me every time. I think it's what's the kind of ballady song on the second side?
Is it Why Can't It Wait Till Morning?
No, it's like 1 or 2 before then.
Don't Let Him Steal Your Heart Away?
That's it. Because there's a couple lines in there when he repeats it. No, don't say it. I know. Like it's just he really knows how to get you. So I think if I had to make it 3/4, it'd be Duke, Nursery Crime, and then one of Phil's first 2 albums.
Did you say Nursery Crime?
I said if I had to go 3 albums, I would do Duke to get people in my top 3 to get people into it would be either Duke, Nursery Crime, and from solo, I'd suggest one of Phil's first 2 albums.
Yeah, I kind of took it in that way of also kind of like, if there was somebody who didn't know Genesis or the solo albums, what would I recommend to them? And for Genesis, I would go with Selling England.
Yep.
Because it was, for me, it was after kind of being a kid of the 80s and kind of being familiar with stuff from the Mama album, Mama and That's All, and then Invisible Touch. Selling England was the first Gabriel-led album that I heard. And it was surprising, but I got it. And it was like, it connected with me. So I was like, okay, I think that could be an entryway into that stranger Genesis. So Genesis, I was thinking Peter Gabriel 4 would be another entryway into Peter's career. And I also was thinking, Hello, I Must Be Going for Phil's career. Although again, I think you're starting at the peak, and then where else do you like if I only had that album from Phil's career, I'd be okay. I like other Phil stuff, but that album to me is his best album, even though he doesn't give it much credit.
It was a surprise to me when you did that.
Yeah, I love that album, and it's just like, I think it's great. And for many of the same reasons Tom said, the kind of prickly part of me would like to say The Fugitive by Tony Banks, because I also love that album for many reasons. But I also know that it would be an acquired taste for many. So my 3 would be Selling England, Security, Peter Gabriel 4, and Hello, I Must Be Going.
Okay. I got my 3, Martin. So I'll
Andy.
go 3. Well, I'm going to go 3, 2, 1. So for a solo career, I'm going to go with Hackett's Acolyte, because you've got Rutherford on there, you've got Phil on there with Star of Sirius, so you've got those other guys
and drumming. He drums on the entire album too.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So you've got Phil on there too, represented drumming and singing, so you can see kind of where Phil would go as a solo career down the road, plus just being just a great record by Steve himself. One from Peter and one from Phil's era of Genesis. 2, I'm going to go with Duke. I agree with both of you guys as well. Home run of an album that will just slay every time. Even songs like Cul-de-sac, I mean, are just fantastic.
Fantastic.
Fantastic. For just wonderful songs. Even the deep cuts on Duke are just off the charts great.
Even Alone Tonight?
Yes. Even Alone Tonight.
I just had to get you on record for that.
Yeah, even Alone Tonight. But as Tom so wonderfully said, please don't ask. I mean, you couldn't find a more emotional song to ever listen to. I mean, you hear that song and it just gives you goosebumps, because it's real. It's real, and it's sad, and it's so emotional. And the fact that it made a Genesis record, I mean, it would have been that or Face Value. We would have gotten on even one of those. But the fact that it's on Duke, which was already a great record, makes it even better. Yeah, and then just the whole Duke's Travel, Duke's End. I mean, I can't wait to see this on Saturday. This tribute band do it.
Right.
We'll see how they do, the Genesis show. We'll see how they do it. But yeah, and then of course, for the Peter album, I'll go with Selling England by the Pound as well, to encapsulate everything about the Peter era, Britannia. Well, without going deep into Foxtrot or anything, or Nursery Crime, I think Selling England by the Pound with the Cinema Show and Firth of Fifth as the 2 kind of heavy tracks there on that album that kind of weigh it down. And of course, Dancing with the Moonlit Night as well. But those 3 really kind of encapsulate everything about what is pure and great about early Genesis on that record.
Sounds good.
Those are my 3.
Martin, how about you?
Yeah.
2 of mine have already been picked, because my favorite Genesis album is actually Selling England by the Pound.
Very good.
Because all the reasons that have already been said basically about that album. But I mean, that sort of goes in line with my other choice for a Phil era, which would be Duke as well. The t-shirt I'm wearing. There's similarities between them, because you've got these big, progressive pieces in there, such as on Selling England, like you said, you've got Firth of Fifth and all those tracks on there. And with Duke, you've got the whole Duke suite all the way through. Yeah. And then in between, you've got these other little bits. And it's a really good sort of like show of the 2 different eras of Genesis, in a sense. And it shows, it's almost like a mirror, almost like a way of showing you what they've been and what they will be. Both albums are like transitions.
Yep.
And as an aside, I think Duke works better the way that it is. Well, there's that eternal argument where people say, would it have been better if they'd have had the whole of that Duke thing all the way through on the entire one side of an album. I actually think it works nicely as a bookend with you've got the in there and then the end.
Yeah,
and
I
then
agree.
when you do the end, you've also got the hints or the little motifs, musical, through all the other songs that aren't part of the Duke suite there as well. So it's like a really nice ending to the album.
And I'm still hearing, when I listen to those bits, I still kind of pick out bits where I'm like, oh, I never realized this is a repeat, that little bit there.
Yeah,
it's like,
coming back again.
So much arrangement in that. So
the 2 or 3 minutes at the end of Duke's Travels and Duke's End might be 3 or 4 minutes of the best music I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
That could just set the world on fire. And you all know what I'm talking about. It's just absolutely electrifying, incredible, intense music that just is, you can't put into words how great it is.
They knew starting off with the Duke's intro, both in 2007 and in the last tour. That's a way to start a show. That gets that's a great both opening and then playing that Duke's End bit at the end. It's like this works. So this is fantastic.
Yeah.
And my choice from solo career would be Pete's third album, Melt.
Excellent.
Oh, okay. Good choice.
Yeah.
And we've already mentioned a couple of my favorites on there with Intruder and I Don't Remember. I think it's a solid album, start to finish. And
yeah. And there's so many albums that you ask me this question tomorrow and I could give you 3 different albums. As soon as I said it, I was like, oh, Trick of the Tail would be a great replacement if I didn't say Song England.
Right.
You know, because again, that's another great intro. I mean, Abacab would be a great intro for the reasons that we did it as our first episode and everything. And so there's so many things. I could name you 3 Ant Phillips albums that I think would be a great intro for people to get into things. Trespass itself would be a great intro because it always can show what the potential is for that. I could probably make an argument for From Genesis to Revelation being an album. Maybe about half of that album.
Maybe half it, but I mean, Trespass, Stagnation. I mean, come on.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Looking for Someone is another classic on there, and it's just like, I mean, there's all the tracks on there just work on a level that I always have to remember. These guys were like 19 and 20 when they did this stuff. And Peter left the band when he was 25, 26 type of thing. I'm like,
right.
You know, it's like they were so young when they were doing this. It's like you kind of get why they were like, why Peter was like, I got to leave. I'm 25 years old. It's like, you're barely an adult at that point. You have to kind of, he was full of piss and vinegar. So he was just like, I got to get out of here and do this stuff. Same thing with Steve. A couple of years later, it's like, they don't see the option of, oh, I could actually talk this out and try to work something out with these people versus just deciding to leave. But that's youth for you. So it is what it is.
Yeah.
So this is almost a stupid question, this. So what sort of research do you do leading up to doing the shows? And do you have a specific structure that you have doing each show?
Yeah, I'll say for research, just like when we're doing an album review, I listen to the album like usually solidly 2 times, doing notes each time. To have something to talk about, just to make sure that there's notes. Sometimes I use the notes per track, sometimes not. Sometimes as we're talking, people say stuff that I've written down. So I'm like, oh, good, I don't have to say that or whatever. And then other times as in the conversation, you're just like, it's not relevant to bring that stuff up, or it's not the way the conversation was going. I think for interviews, it is a lot more of just trying to come up with good questions to ask people. So questions, I think it's good to be prepared so that you don't want to be a slave to the questions, but I think that you have good questions so that then if the person says something interesting when you're interviewing them, you can follow that tangent because you're prepared, and you could always jump back to your questions if you need to. But I'm a big believer in trying to let the conversation go where it goes and have a structure in your head for it, but not necessarily if the subject wants to talk about something else or isn't interested in your structure, you got to figure out what they want to talk about and what they're open to talking about. So research wise, we always, especially Simon and now Tom, tends to do the reading of the Wikipedia article for the album if we're talking about an album. And I view that as both giving people general knowledge of things, but also like, let's see if Wikipedia got this right.
puts it in context, kind of gives it a starting point, and
Yeah.
then we usually, as most of the episodes are structured, where we'll do an intro, maybe we'll have a couple minutes of discussion, and then we'll go track by track. Mike will usually give the most hysterical joke and intro I've ever heard in my life, as he segues into the song.
Right.
And the best part is a little into how the sausage is made, like what Michael say, and we'll start with our first track, Invisible Touch. And then we'll all be quiet for a second and be like, blah, 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 blah. This is where Mike puts in the music.
Yeah.
And then we'll go around the table and say, all right, who wants to talk first? Like, so that Mike will know, like, after the song that Biddy plays, someone's going to take the lead who has really enthusiasm about that particular song. So that's another just a fun little thing where it's like, all right, who wants to talk first?
Yeah.
Me.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, like at the start of all this, here's a little bit of how the sausage is made too. Like I really thought that back when it was the five of us, that we should each like lead an episode, that I didn't want to be quote unquote the host of the show. And I remember at the start of it kind of saying like, oh, Simon, do you want to do this? Tom, do you want to do this? Stacey, Ellie, do you want to do this? And it was always like, oh no, you can do it. And finally, Simon just said to me at one point, Mike, you're the host of the show. And I was like, okay, but I didn't advocate for this, but I just thought that there should always be kind of like a captain of the episode. And that's part of the job of saying like, okay, who's going to be the first one to talk? You want to keep things going. And my dad was a high school English teacher. Maybe it's in my blood that I can kind of get people organized and do this stuff. So like, I mean, yes, I'm quote unquote the host. Tom is the host of the show too. Nobody's a co-host. It's just, we're all just hosts at this point. I just happen to be the guy who talks first most of the time. So.
And most.
Yeah. Yeah. That's another unfortunate thing about being a teacher's son, I think, is that I can go off without a problem.
Well, so. When we talk about research and how we like to listen to the album several times before and take notes, so we have some talking points. A lot of the times, these are albums that the majority of ones we've talked about, we know inside out, start to finish. We've been listening to them for decades. But some of my favorite episodes are ones where at least one of us has either never heard the album before or only once. And the times I remember are when we did, and then there were three. Obviously, I think the four of us listened to it since the late 80s when we first got into Genesis. Simon had purchased it, I think, in the late 70s or early 80s, listened to it once, and then never listened to it again because he always wanted to have a Genesis album that he could go back to and visit at some point. So that was a really interesting episode where when he did his research, he was listening to the album for a second time ever, a third time ever.
Yeah.
The other two episodes, when we did The Fugitive and Mike's Acting Very Strange, I'd never heard a note of either of those albums before we set those up. So whereas Mike had heard them and I think our guests had been very familiar with them, when I was putting them on, I was taking notes, and all my notes were initial first impressions of hearing these songs for the first time. So it seemed very a unique perspective to someone who would live with this album for decades, where I'm like, all right, I'm actually, and how many times do you actually do that? Listen to an album for the very first time and record your initial reactions.
Yeah.
But I needed to do that for the show. And sorry, another tangent. Those two episodes were some of my favorite because they elicited the most reactions from viewers when we said we're going to do those shows.
Yeah.
A lot of, why would you do that? That's the worst album in Genesis canon. The Fugitive, have you heard Tony sing? Like it elicited more, not vitriol, but like just like
probably confusion.
But
it got people talking.
It got people talking.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
It's
Acting
like
Very Strange was the same way. Yeah.
It was like Howard Stern. The haters listened to him more than the listeners did.
Yeah,
they just
Stern, Imus, take your pick. Same thing.
Yeah.
But and I think like at some point this year, I would be shocked if we didn't do Geese and the Ghost. And Tom, I know that's an album that you've probably heard very little. And
ever since we talked about it, I've listened to that quite a bit. I really enjoyed that.
Oh, good.
album,
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And I like it. I just haven't.
Thumbs up for that one.
Yeah. Like I like it, but I know that when I listen to it again for the podcast, it's going to be like, oh yeah, I know this, but I really need to listen to this so I can talk hopefully intelligently about it. And that's something with those type of albums. Like, again, okay, I have to talk about Invisible Touch. Yeah, I'll listen to it once or twice, but I know this album. With any of the main Genesis albums.
You especially that album. You grew up.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's like the alphabet. You can recite it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but But Seriously, which is the next Phil album we're going to do, like I know that album, but I haven't listened to that album from start to finish in 10 to 15 years, probably. So I've certainly probably heard all the individual tracks, but have I sat, well, I'll say in the last 10 years, I probably have, whenever the reissue came out, I probably listened to it start to finish, but that's kind of it. And so even looking at the titles of this album, I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of know what that song is. I think I know that song, but other ones I'm just like, Father to Son, I couldn't tell you what that sounds like right now. So listening to that is not going to be a new experience, but it's going to be a fresh experience, which will be kind of nice.
Anyway, and Andy's got to leave us now because he's got something to go to.
Yeah.
I do. It's an early start for me in the morning, gentlemen.
Understood.
As you can appreciate. But I'm going to go. But I hope that you stay on with Martin. And it's been a blast talking to you.
Yeah.
I would love. I mean, hey, 3 Jersey guys, I could do this with you anytime you want.
Definitely, sure.
Yeah,
and I have to say, yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I would say we'd love to meet up at a show.
Yeah,
sure.
Lots of stuff coming up. I know Steve's touring again this year, doing the Lamb highlights. So it'd be great to meet up with one of those. Yeah.
I don't think that those dates have been posted for state shows yet for Steve.
Not for up
Not
here.
Yet, no.
Yeah. I'm sure they will be coming soon. It's probably in the fall, I would bet.
I think, Lamb highlights, but absolutely. I mean, we'll reach out and make contact. And I'd love to meet up with you guys in person at one of these shows.
Yeah. And I just have to tell you, one of my favorite McCartney tracks, Solo,
yes,
Junior's Farm.
There you go. 50 years old. 50 years old this year. Believe it or not.
I'll tell you, that's one of those songs I heard as a kid, loved. And then I think when I saw him at Yankee Stadium 2015 or so, it was the third track he played, and I almost cried during. And it was just like, it was one of those things. I'm like, why am I getting emotional over Junior's Farm? And I'm like, it's just one of those songs that's so happy. And I'm just like, oh, it just kills me every time I hear it. So
yeah, another one of those lyrics, they don't make any sense.
They don't, but it's
houses
just
the Parliament and the whole bit.
Yeah, but it's just the chorus is just so up, and it's just so that's my little McCartney story. So that's that. So
awesome. Well, Mike and Tom, it was a blast to meet with you virtually and geek out about Genesis. I've been following your podcast not since the beginning, but I want to say at least since 2017-ish. So
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
We're happy to have any listeners at all. So again, keep listening and keep giving us feedback and let us know what you think.
Oh, will do. And Martin, we'll talk to you next time. And thanks for the invite.
Tell everybody about Two Legs very quickly then, Andy.
Oh yeah, Two Legs, a Paul McCartney podcast, is a weekly Paul McCartney podcast.
Wow.
Weekly.
My
weekly
God.
Just solo. And we just do, for the most part, solo Paul. We dabble a little bit into Beatles, but mostly it's all solo Paul that I do with my co-host, Tom Hunyadi. We're on YouTube and traditional podcast audio only outlets. And we had our most recent show that went posted this past week, where we talked about our predictions for 2024 in terms of releases, tours, albums, and we're doing quite well. We're at almost 2,000 subs on YouTube, and the audio platform does very well as well. As you gentlemen know, this is what you just do, audio. So there's different fans for each. So yeah, we're happy. We just, if there's breaking news with Paul, we try to go live and talk about it. But it's fun. It's fun. We'll both be at Beatle Fest in a few weeks' time, which is the 60th anniversary of the Beatles arriving in America. Obviously, 64, now 2024, and 50 years of the Beatle Fest. So there'll be a lot of activity, and Tom, my co-host, and I will be at a lot of these events, and we'll tell everybody about them in there. And if you are channeling your inner Beatle geekdom, check us out on YouTube and give us a like. But thank you.
Cool.
That's cool. For anyone listening or watching, that will probably have been around 5 or 6 weeks before this episode goes out, because I've got 5, 6 episodes in the can.
Okay, so this will be out by then, but but all good. But thank you. But Martin, thank you for the invite. And Mike and Tom, it was a blast talking Genesis with you.
Same here.
See you soon.
Andy. Take care.
Bye.
And then there were 3.
And then there were
yes. There's always a Genesis reference.
There's always a Genesis reference.
So Tom has about 10, 15 minutes left at this point.
Yeah. So. We're not at Duke's End yet.
Not yet. So
I was very quickly going to say that. So I hinted at it earlier on when you were talking about "Hello, I Must Be Going." When you did that on the episode, because I have this, I think it's a great habit. When you're going to listen to one of your episodes that's about an album or about something that they've done, I think it's a good idea to listen first and then listen to your show afterwards. That's something that I always do with these sort of shows, and with yours particularly. That's how I started doing. I mean, that thing. It's the first show I started doing that with, where I'd listen to the album and then listen to the show about it. Hello, I Must Be Going was one of those where it's an album that I'd sort of not listened to very much over the years. And then suddenly when your episode was coming up, I thought, I'm going to have a listen to this. And I was really surprised by the album, because it's one that I'd sort of like steered away from, in a sense, thinking, well, because I'd always had this idea of the album before and the album after being the albums, and this one being the one in between. Right. Oh, because he's got You Can't Hurry Love there, and he's got this there, and he's got that there, and it's like, it's sort of like the in between, the leftovers, and that. But it's a really good album.
Yeah, it's on that episode. I've said that it's my perfect balance of pop Phil and weird Phil.
Yeah,
and that's what I love about it. And I think every song on there is great. And as Tom said before, with "Don't Let Him Steal Your Heart Away," it's like there are these songs that you can listen to, and at different ages it will hit you differently. And so maybe with you revisiting it, kind of as we did too, it might have been years since you heard it, but it hit you now differently than it did 15 years ago or 20 years ago, or however long it might have been. And so I think that's a great thing. And I know that I've heard some other people say the same thing, where it's like, oh, when I know that it's going to be an album, even if it's an album I know, I'll listen to it again because I want to be fresh on it. And I think that's a great way to go into it.
And some of the nicest comments that we've gotten are listeners who say, I listened to the episode, it made me go back and listen to the album a little bit differently. And you touched on some things that I didn't notice before. And that's what we do with each other during the episode. We'll talk about things that we might not have heard before, and someone else is hearing that same new thing who's listening to the show, and they'll go back and listen to it, whether it's just a musical part that never really caught our attention before, or a misheard lyric that one of us has gotten wrong for the last 30 years and are corrected by the rest of the tabletop.
Live on podcast.
And now we know it's not bundles of fibers.
Yes. Or Heath A's.
It's Heath A's. Sorry. Right. I'll go to the grave on that one.
But it's great because, and Stacy was queen of doing this, where sometimes when you're getting set up beforehand, you start chatting about, oh yeah, this was a good track, this was something else. And Stacy would always be like, save it for the podcast. Don't talk anything about the album before we hit that record button. And that's still kind of a joke, but a serious thing we do, where Tom and I are chatting about things. And with these Gabriel kind of mini episodes we did over the past year, I didn't know what Tom thought about it until we started talking about it on air, as it were, because I think that's what keeps it interesting for the two of us, where sometimes there might have been things where I thought Tom would have liked this one, or I thought Tom wouldn't have liked this one, but he did or didn't. And same thing with him for me, I would think.
Right. I just got interrupted because somebody's brought me a drink in. Thank you.
Oh, no, that's all good.
How do I get
waitress?
Yeah, I was going to say, good table service here.
Was that Tony Banks bringing you drinks? He's driving people around. He's bringing drinks.
He's doing
to
everything. It's Uber Eats, I think, now too. So,
but yeah, and I mean something that going back to something that Andy was saying as well about when we both had the same experience. We were looking for a Genesis podcast, and you were the only show that I'd found as well at that point. But also, the logo as well is a great in, because It's the perfect logo for a Genesis podcast.
That is all Simon.
All Simon. Yep.
Simon was, I think that he did the very initial one, which was kind of a collage of some of the album covers with the same kind of Duke font saying Tabletop Genesis, and then redid it by taking a picture of a bunch of the CDs on the table with the microphones there. And why bother? Why mess with perfection at this point? I think that's going to be our logo until we stop doing this whenever we're retired. So
and a little bit of trivia, like probably the biggest version of that is on the website, tabletopgenesis.com. If you zoom in, you can see Simon's reflection in the microphone taking the picture.
Yes. So because Simon was the person who came up with the idea of doing a podcast. Was when he was involved, he did all the recording and editing and kind of layering the music in there. And I have tried to mimic his style as much as possible with the structure of the episodes and the editing that he would do and everything. So it's been fun. It's been a fun ride, and I hope that it keeps going for a while.
And that's kind of how it's set up. Like Mike and I record, whether it's with a guest. Obviously, we'll take pauses when we introing a song if we're going track by track. Once we're done, Mike takes it. He adds our normal heads and tails, the outros, the intros, adds song bits. Sometimes we try to have little bits of music if we're happening to referencing something like, oh, I really love Daryl's guitar solo, and Mike will have that underneath as we're talking about it. He'll finish the episode. He'll send me a copy of it. I'll do a listen for it and make sure it's okay and no dropouts or everything sounds good. Then he gives me the final file. I do my magic on my end to get it up on iTunes and out to all the channels. And he does the Twitter promotion. I do the Facebook promotion. And that's kind of that.
Yeah. And if it's I always say if it's a 2-hour episode, it takes between 4 to 6 hours to edit it and pull all the music together and everything. And I think as I've done it more, I've kind of come up with a workflow that makes it more on that 4-hour end of things than the 6-hour end of things, because by the time I'm done with it, I will probably, I don't want to say I would never listen to it again, but it's kind of like sometimes people, because they're discovering these episodes, sometimes years after we've recorded them, somebody will come around and say, oh, on your Duke episode, you said X. And what do you think about that? And I'm just like, I have no idea what I said in the Duke episode. I know what I think now about that track, but is it the same as what I thought 7 years ago when we recorded that? Maybe, but maybe not. So sometimes we're called upon to defend our opinion from a long time ago. And I'm like, yeah, sure. Maybe it's like, maybe I'll agree with that. Maybe not at this stage. So, but that's the fun of it. That like our episodes were kind of intentionally, but also unintentionally designed to be timeless, because we're not talking about the modern releases, except with things like IO or the new Steve Hatchett album coming out. But we're talking about, Nursery Crime. You can listen to that at any point. It's not like Nursery Crime's going to change between now and then. So, it gives it a bit more freedom to talk about what we want to talk about with it.
Okay, I'm going to have to talk really quickly if I've got to fit all this in 3 minutes. We've still got 2 questions from listeners.
I think I can hold out a little bit longer.
All right, okay. Let's get those listener questions.
Should we do those quick questions?
Yeah, let's do those.
Sure, yeah, I'm here.
So the author, Owen Ling, he said, a question for you 2 guys is, do you think it was a mistake to call time on Ray Wilson after only 1 album? Or do you think that Genesis would have done more damage to the brand if they'd have tried to have made a second album with him? That's
I know
really
a lot of people.
Question, is it?
It is.
I know a lot of people say that he was kind of given the short shrift of it, and that they kind of wasn't told that it was the end. Like all of a sudden, he wasn't called back. They're not doing a second album. And I think he was really hoping that the momentum from the first album, if there was any, would continue into a second album and at least give it a chance. And I don't know. I think a second album would have been fine, but it just seemed like they were going uphill at that point. And I don't think Mike or Tony, I think more Mike, didn't really have the energy to give it what it needed to get going after having brought Genesis to the top of the mountain, like I think they saw it as a gargantuan task to do this, and I just don't think Mike was up for it. So I don't know, maybe it would have been just lack of energy if Mike was just going through the motions to try to give it a sophomore effort. But I think it is what it is. I do feel bad for Ray in a lot of ways. It's kind of like an asterisk in the Genesis history, but we'll never know. That's like the alternate history that we sometimes talk about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the alternate universe where they did a second album or even a third album at that point. And I like Calling All Stations, so I'll give it that plug. And I see Mike's perspective where I think on one of the reissue interviews, he basically said, if this was going to work, we had to do like album tour, and kind of get back into that almost 1970s rhythm of things. And at the time, as funny to say, as a 50-some-year-old guy, he was just like, I don't want to do that. And when you've already been successful, do you want to try to be successful again?
Yeah.
And kind of either run the risk of not being successful, or you're just kind of fighting to get back to where you were again. And it's kind of like, if you decide that either for the money, for the ego, for whatever, you don't need to do it, then probably better not to do it. Like I know that like Tony Banks has said like that initially he wasn't quite sure of it, but Mike was really gung-ho when they started Calling All Stations. And then by the end of it, it was almost reversed, where Tony was more gung-ho to continue, but Mike was kind of like, yeah, this is going to take more effort than he wanted to do. And yeah, so I think that I see Mike's perspective on that, because I think even if Phil had not left, if that 1996-97 Genesis album had been with Phil instead of with Ray Wilson, it certainly would have done better than it did. But even Phil was not selling the way he had been selling in the past. And I don't think Genesis would have been selling the way that they sold for We Can't Dance and for Invisible Touch and everything. So it would have been, they wouldn't have canceled a US tour. I'm sure of that, but they wouldn't have kind of been at that level of where they had been at. And I think they would have been okay with that. But I think that's more the interesting alternate history of, what if Phil hadn't left after We Can't Dance?
Yeah, because there's some really good musical ideas there for the three of them to have worked together on.
Like I could see the gaps becoming longer, like kind of like they do a Calling All Stations in that mid to late 90s, and then that they don't do anything else until early to mid 2000s or whatever, or even 2007 again, because it's like I think at that point it was the thing where the album sales were becoming less and less in general for all of them. So it was like, well, why put out albums if we don't have to? That I think that Peter Gabriel is the example of saying you can be an older artist and still put out good material. I kind of wish that Genesis took that lesson and had done something in 2007, 2008, or even when putting out albums or putting out individual tracks, just saying, hey, we got into the studio and recorded 3 songs. Here you go. It's not like Peter Gabriel nor Genesis has to prove anything nowadays.
Well, Stephen Nicholson, who does the show Trimming the Musical Fat, he said, because he's doing a bit of self-promotion here as well.
That's all good.
Around the time that this episode will be going out, they will be releasing an episode about We Can't Dance. And so this tells his opinion, really, in a sense. So he said, do you guys agree that We Can't Dance, the album, is a bit long?
Yes.
And because they're doing the episode, and so they're getting your opinion on that, as they've got an episode coming out as well.
Yeah.
What we had talked about when we recorded this episode was the tendency in the late 80s, early 90s for CD bloat, where because now you had 70 minutes of music that you could put on a record, you didn't cut things that wouldn't have made a 45, 50-minute LP. So you had 12 songs on that album, which I think could have easily been a more solid 8 or 9 songs. I mean, there's like 3 off the bat that I could say could easily have been B-sides, and that would have been a much stronger album. I love the album because it was the first album I got that was new after I became a Genesis fan, so I have a lot of sentiment towards it. But yeah, 3 or 4 songs could have easily been cut, and it's like it's not like, oh, which one? It's like, no, that one, and that one.
Right. And I agree. I think it could have been cut down. We might be thinking of 2 or 3 different songs, but probably at least 1 or 2 of the same. I think that, yeah, it's a little bit too long. They had a lot of good tracks, not as many great tracks as that album should have had. And I think if you cut out Since I Lost You, if you cut out Way of the World, and maybe one other one, Never a Time. Yeah, Never a Time. Never a Time just doesn't do anything. So yeah, I think those 3. Is that what you were thinking of, Tom, or what were your 3?
I think those were at the start, the 3. Maybe there's a 4th one, but I couldn't think of one off the top of the head that I would pick.
Yeah. Yeah. There's 1 or 2 other ones that might be on the chopping block. I know people love On the Shoreline too. So it's like, oh, let's take out one and put that one back in. We start arguing that. But I agree with the letter writer that it is a long album that doesn't need to be as long as it is.
It's a double LP.
Yeah. Basically.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Like, literally, like if you bought it, it was 2 LPs.
Right. Yeah.
And I think the running order was actually different on the 2 LPs than on the CD.
Yeah. If I remember
that would mean doing research for the show, and we never did research.
Who knows? Yeah. If I remember right, Simon said basically ditch the whole album except for Fading Lights. He said make it an EP or 1-track EP, which I would certainly not go that far. But I also get where he's coming from with that comment. So I disagree, but I see where he's saying it. So
Absolutely.
What about you, Martin? Do you think that is a bloated album, or what do you think about that?
Well, I actually agree with the 3 songs that you said to remove to make it a nice, neater album.
Yeah.
And I mean, but there are some. I mean, I was going to say they recorded enough material there that they could have made an entire other disc with all the other stuff that they'd recorded.
Yeah.
So,
or if they did like an EP like they did with the Paper Late stuff, the Paper Late, you might recall, and Me and Virgil, you didn't have that little bonus album. That could be a nice little thing, like, or a Spot the Pigeon type of thing. So
I've got that on EP. I've got that EP on vinyl down there.
There you go. I have it around here somewhere too. Or if it's not Way of the World, there's the other track, the one with kind of this 12-stringy sound to it. God, I'm forgetting what it's called. It's now I'm blanking on it. But there's that track that I'm thinking with a Rickenbacker 12-string sound to it that's a bit more upbeat. And it's a Mike Rutherford lyric. And it's probably about halfway to 3/4 of the way through it. Way of the World is a little bit weird, so I do like that one, but it could be taken off too. It's not to bother me that I'm not remembering. Tell me why. Tell me why it could be cut out too.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well.
Yeah, maybe even more than Way of the World, but yeah. So that could be number 4, even if it goes on the EPs. So, but yeah, that's a good question from the listener there, because I think I'll be curious to hear if it sounds kind of what you said, Martin, that they agree with that also, that it could be cut down, but what tracks can get cut can always be up in the air.
Trying to think of another B-side that I absolutely love from that era as well. I can't remember what it was, that I think would have been good as an album track.
Was it the really upbeat one, or do you remember kind of what it sounded like? Or
was it Feeding the Fire from Invisible Touch?
Oh, that's Invisible Touch. Yeah,
that's Invisible Touch, Feeding the Fire.
That is
but a great track. Yeah,
yeah. There was one actually from the We Can't Dance era, but I can't remember.
Let's see if my memory is good with this.
I think there was two. Was On the Shoreline.
There was On the Shoreline, and I'd Rather Be You, or was
no? I think that was
the Urkel sounding one.
I think that was Invisible Touch.
That's Invisible Touch era. God, I got all my CDs here. I could just look at it, roll over, and check these things out. But again, that would involve movement. So. Yeah. But no, I think that there's always entertainment that can happen with these things, and kind of coming up with the alternate histories is fun. So,
okay. So what advice would you give to people if they were starting a podcast of their own? Who's going to go for that one?
I'll say, I think it's important to do it to know what you want to do, but be open to what the changes might be as you figure out what you're actually doing. And also do it I think, I like your thing of doing this solo podcast, but bringing people into it. And I always thought that if you're going to have a group of people, a trio is a good dynamic to have talk with. I mentioned a little bit before that I think a trio is good. You can get up to 5 people and have a good dynamic. Any more than that, you start not knowing who's talking and everything. Trios, duos can work, but I think you have to either keep it short the way Tom and I did with the Peter Gabriel shows this past year, or bring in a third person to chat every once in a while to keep the dynamic fresh. So that's my thing. And hopefully do it with people you enjoy talking with and that you both agree with on a lot, but that you definitely aren't going to agree about everything, because it's no fun to just agree about everything.
Yeah. Tom?
Oh, my first bit of advice is Hearts on Fire.
Hearts on Fire. There we go.
that was the other
Yes.
B-side from
Right.
I cheated. I looked up that.
Fair
But
enough.
I say just kind of, I think we looked into it because we enjoyed doing what we're doing before even the idea of the podcast came about. It was almost like sticking a mic into a room where people are having fun. Nothing was forced. Nothing was, oh, I don't know the subject, but I want to do a podcast about it, so I better learn everything about it. Like, we all knew the subject very well. We had fun talking about it. I think people understood that we weren't taking ourselves too seriously. We would make mistakes. We would correct each other. We would laugh. It was just like a fun camaraderie that people wished they could be in the room with us. And I think that was the staying power that it's had, is that we've always tried to have fun, not force anything. And if it gets to a point where we're not enjoying it anymore, obviously we'll do something else. But for now, we're having fun doing it. And hopefully that comes across.
Yeah. And that's the thing, like always, the people that we've brought on as guests to kind of be commentating with us, I think they're people who have that same vibe. And it's, again, people that we don't necessarily always agree with, or they agree with us or anything like that. But it's people who can have fun in talking about it and enjoy it and have their own perspective on it. And I think that's where you get the dynamics that are interesting. And there are people that I'm friends with who I've thought like, oh, would this person work on the podcast? I'm like, oh, I actually don't know if they'd be a great podcast person. And I'd love chatting with these people, but I'm like, I don't know if the dynamic would be there. And maybe that's more on me that can't see the potential for things. But I think that's, Mark, I don't know if you get this too, but and I actually just did this with the Star Wars podcast I listened to, where I'm like, I'd really like to be on your podcast. I'd love to talk about this stuff. And I even said, I do my own podcast. And I know this is the most annoying email to get, is please let me be on your podcast so I can talk at you about things. And it's like, but I get why people do that, because they hear us talking about stuff and it's like, I want to be part of that conversation. Like I get that. And maybe we should run a contest to let people be on the podcast with us and see what it's like. But I think it's partially, but I also, with us whittling down to 2, I also kind of get like with, again, I'll bring it back to Genesis, why Tony and Mike are kind of like, oh, this 2-person thing, this can work, because there's less options to kind of go in and everything, where it makes it easier to manage 2 people versus 5. The 5 were great. That was a lot of fun. And if we found the right other 3 people, I'd be totally open to doing that again. But would it be a 5-person equal thing, or would it be Tom and I being in charge and 3 people kind of being not hired hands, but because we have no money for this? But it's like, would it be kind of junior and senior level members and everything? Not that that's a problem, but would it be a problem? I don't know. So 2 people seems to work, is what I'm thinking. And then having guests rotating in and out works pretty well. So, and have the main thing, to get back to the question, have fun with it. Enjoy what you're doing, because yes, some people make money with podcasts, but the great majority of people, I bet, don't.
No.
And so you're not doing this to make money or fame. So you have to enjoy what you're talking about, and you have to enjoy the people that you do it with. So, and Tom and I are friends. This is one of those things where it's like we actually enjoy each other's company, and it's fun to get together and talk about this stuff. And it's also fun to just get together and be like, let's meet for drinks in the city. We both work in New York City. So, and not that we're going to the office much, but we meet up when we can and everything. And that's a good time. So
we're going to see Total Mass Retain in April.
That's right. A Yes cover band, tribute band in mid-April in New York City. I still have to pay you for that, Tom, I think. So I will get you that money. So call off your attack dogs. But
my ex-bandmates still owe me for concerts that I've paid for them to go to.
Oh, wow. We got to, if you need us to kind of put some pressure on them, let us know.
If you need some muscle,
I'll send in the heavies.
Exactly. So what other questions are there? Anything we can answer for anyone?
So,
or for you? It's like, that's.
Oh, okay. I've got another one from Steve. Steve
H from London.
Steve H. Steve Hogarth from London says, if only. I should have contacted him, actually. Where did I put that picture? What was another one from? Yeah, another one that Stephen from Trimming the Musical Fat came out with. Well, I think each of us have probably answered, or we've answered this anyway, which is, which 70s Genesis album would they recommend for someone listening to the band for the first time? I would go with Selling England for the pound.
Yeah. Selling England or Trick.
Yeah.
Selling England
or
Trick.
Trick is a beautiful album.
Trick.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Trick is probably a little bit more accessible than Selling England, but they're also, I think of those two albums as very bookends to each other anyway, with the Lamb in the middle being almost from a different band in a different universe. Like Genesis never did anything that quite sounded like that before or after that album. And so it's very unique in their thing. So yeah, Selling England and Trick would be good recommendations there.
So we were speaking about podcast advice. What podcast do you listen to that you think have got it right?
I hate to admit it, but I don't really listen to that many podcasts. I know Mike listens to more than I do.
Yeah.
Try listening to the one that the guys from Arrested Development put out. Jason.
Oh, right. Jason Bateman and
Smartless. Yes. I enjoyed that a lot. I just have to revisit it a little bit, but Mike's got the ones. Mike has a whole list. The Star Wars one. There's another one.
I have a couple Star Wars ones I listen to. There's Judge John Hodgman, which is kind of a comedy-ish podcast. What else? There's I still listen to Mark Maron's kind of WTF if I like who the subject is. And I usually listen to his intros. And if the person is somebody either that I have no interest in or not much interest in, I'll sometimes skip the interview. Conan O'Brien's podcast is a lot of fun. These two guys do a podcast about horror movies called With Gorley and Rust. It's Matt Gorley and Paul Rust. And there's Blank Check, which is another movie podcast where they go through director filmographies. And that's one where they do movies that I haven't seen. I always watch the movie before the podcast. Yeah. So I make sure that I kind of get what they're talking about. So listen, as you were talking about listening to an album before the podcast, it's like, it's kind of broadened out. It's gotten me to see a lot of movies that have always been on my, I should probably watch that type of list. Or I don't know this director. Let me watch some of these. And sometimes they're good and sometimes they're not as good as I would hope that they would be. And you move on from there. But I don't listen to any other music podcasts.
Pods like us.
Pods like us. Yes.
Wow.
That's what
thumbs up. Big
What's
thumbs
that all
up.
About?
It's funny.
The host is a bit of a wanker, but other than that,
I don't listen to other music podcasts for the most part. Not that your podcast is a music podcast, but it's just not like I'm almost in that mode right now where if I'm going to choose to listen to another podcast, I'm going to knock something off the list because life's too short to have 85 billion podcasts to listen to either. So I kind of want to keep it kind of semi-selective with things. So, because I'm also very much a completist where I kind of, if I'm going to listen to a podcast, I want to listen to the whole thing. So I get what the in-jokes are and stuff like that, if there's anything like that. And that can be, for some long running podcasts, that can be hard to do. But so sometimes I don't always follow that It is what it is. So yeah, I think that find what you like out there. And if there's nothing that's really floating your boat, you don't have to force yourself into it either. So,
or start your own.
Start your own.
Start your
I was
own.
about
Exactly.
to say that. Yep.
Yeah, that too. So, well, that's like some people would say to us, it's more early on than now, but sometimes we would get certain fans saying, "Oh, you guys are all 80s fans. You weren't around in the 70s to talk about what those shows were like or what that was like." And my response was always, start your own show.
Yep.
It's like, we weren't there. We can't talk about that. We can talk about being fans of those albums, but I didn't see the Trick of the Tail tour. I didn't see the Selling England tour. But yeah, more power to you. It's like, we were always, and still are, very much like, if you start up a Genesis podcast, I'll tweet out about it, because I don't, it's not competition. It's all just within the same family. So, and if people listen to us for one reason, listen to another podcast they get something else from it, great. So we're not, you can't be all things to all people. You have to be, I'm very much a believer that if you're specific about what you're like, this is a bit counterintuitive, but the specific is general. Yeah. And so it's like, some people are like, well, I'm trying to appeal to everybody, so I have to be very general. And I do think it's more true that if you are very specific in what you do, people will appreciate that more, because you're being yourself more, whether you're an artist, whether you're a podcast, whether you're an author, or whatever it might be. So that's my philosophy.
Absolutely.
Feels very Spinal Tapian to end that way, but that's my philosophy, Brian.
As long as the drummer doesn't suddenly explode.
Exactly.
Anyway, where can people find you and get a hold of you then, guys?
Anywhere, as I like to say, you get your podcast kicks. So iTunes, Spotify, Google Cast or
Play
Podcast,
or whatever it's called. Yeah.
iHeartRadio. You can also go to tabletopgenesis.com. The episodes are there as well, and that's where we'll do polls. My poll is often seen there.
Tom shows you his poll.
And then Facebook, just search for Tabletop Genesis, and Twitter, we're a different handle, right?
We're Genesis Tabletop on there. And I've started a Blue Sky account too, because again, who knows what the future of Twitter is, but I still haven't posted much on Blue Sky. I need to start getting better at that and everything. So, but Blue Sky is a cool alternative to Twitter if you're not out there. And actually, if you're looking for a Blue Sky account, I have some invite codes still around, so feel free to hit me up for that. So, but yeah, those are the places to find us. Google Tabletop Genesis, and we'll show up. We'll come on your podcast and chat. So that's and give it a listen if it's for you. Great. And if you decide, oh, who are these wankers talking about this stuff, you don't have to listen either. So I'm very happy to have people listen and feel like they're part of the club, and kind of feel like that there's a connection there. So I always appreciate hearing people that they get something out of it.
Anyway, thanks for speaking with me today, guys.
Yeah, and thanks for inviting us on.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, I often see every time that you might have tagged us in tweets along the way. It always gives me warms the cockles of my heart, and I love warm cockles. So thank you. And
you've been a big supporter of this podcast, and so
much appreciated. Yes,
of our podcast, I should say. Yeah.
Yes.
So
absolutely, cool. I love the show.
Excellent.
Anyway, you can find Pods Like Us on Instagram, Twitter, Threads, TikTok, and there is a Facebook page as well. Just look for Pods Like Us. Easiest way to do it. And you can contact us through podslikeus@gmail.com. Anyway, thank you everyone for listening, and hope you listen again to another episode of Pods Like Us. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Martin. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Yep. Sorry for keeping you later.
No worry, all good.
Hey, you're the one who's staying up real late, so
yes.
Tom disappeared. So yeah, I mean, if I'm not sure if it would work out for But Seriously, depending upon Stacy's situation and everything, but definitely if there's other albums that we haven't talked about that you'd be interested in chatting about, let me know, because I think that we could certainly figure stuff out and maybe record at a better time that is not so late in the evening for you. We've had UK people on before and everything, so we're certainly open to that idea.
Okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
Right. I will go and find out what my other half is doing now.
Excellent.
Probably asleep.
Yes. Well, have a good rest of the evening. Get to sleep yourself and everything. So, and let us know also when this is going to go live, and we'll promo it also on our social media feeds and everything to beat the drum for your podcast too. So,
thank you, Mike. Thank you very much. Take care.
Have a great night. Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.